On the 2nd of April 1992, 8 members of an ANC self-defense unit opened fire on 2 policemen on the outskirts of Bethlehem. One officer is killed and the other seriously wounded. Fusi Mofokeng and Tsokolo Mokoena are convicted along with that group, even though they weren't involved in the crime. They spend 19 years in prison for a murder they didn't commit, simply because Mofokeng's brother-in-law was one of the 8. Renowned author Jonny Steinberg has written a book about this injustice after reading an article about it in 2011. When you read the Sunday Times article by Philip Rohn about Fusi and Tsokolo, what is it that drew you to this story?
Well, it was just one thing that Fusi said. You know, the story recounted their ordeal, their terrible injustice, 19 years in prison for something they didn't do, going to the Truth Commission saying you're innocent and therefore we can't let you out of jail. After all that, Rowan said to Fusi, what surprised you most when you walked into a democratic South Africa for the first time in 2011? And he said, what surprised me more than anything else is I was sitting in a restaurant and a white waitress came up to me and asked me what I wanted to eat. And it just struck me that, you know, we who go through this country day after day forget what has changed and what hasn't. And I really wanted to meet this man and talk to him while the world around him was still surprising, you know, before it became ordinary. I just wanted to see what he saw. That was my very first motivation, and I immediately wrote to him and asked if I could meet him.
But it took some time for him to answer, didn't it?
He's a very cautious man, very, very deliberate. He read what I had to say closely, he took some advice, he spoke around the issue for a while, we met a couple of times, and after thinking very carefully, he decided to go ahead and to work with me. And in the end, we worked together for 5 years.
How do you approach a story like this? Because it obviously requires some sensitivity.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think the most important thing is to do as much work as you possibly can. Not just to get Fusi to tell the story, but to tell it again and again in different contexts, in different circumstances. I then tried to meet as many people as I could who knew him at any stage of his life. You know, I looked for teachers from school. I looked for an early employer who employed him to work in the garden when he was 13. All of his surviving aunts and uncles. I then tried to meet every warder I could find who had known him in prison, the cellmates I could still get hold of. And you just find that the more perspectives you get, the more stories you get, the nature of the tale changes. Memory is such a mercurial, strange beast. Everybody remembers things differently. And it's just that getting that multiplicity of perspectives is so valuable.
How would you describe Fusi and Tsokolo as people?
You know, I got to know Fusi much, much better than Tsokolo because it's him who I worked with. You know, I can't say this for sure because I didn't know Fusi when he was 16 or 19 years old. But from the scraps of evidence about what sort of person he was as a teenager, I think that something very, very profound happened to him in prison. And in this may be a dramatic way of putting it, but that he perhaps became a different person. You know, he grew up in a very rough place where the world was not made in a way that was going to carve out a decent future for people like him. You know, the boys who grew up with, he was very, very close to 3 boys. They were together each weekend. They were drinking. They were chasing women. They were just being teenage boys. The other 3 did not turn out well. 2 died young. You know, 1 died in a car accident. Another died of AIDS. A third had a very tough life. Fusi walked out of prison at the age of 44. And within no time had made a life. He was married and in love. He had adopted his wife's children. He had a good job. He came out of prison this extraordinarily functional, together person with a great moral center. And I think that strangely, despite the huge injustice that happened to him, he worked on himself in prison, and in a way became somebody new. And for me, that was the most exciting part of the story to tell.
Yeah. And Tsokolo?
Tsokolo and I decided not to work together from the beginning. And really, a book like this comes out of intense engagements over a long period of time. And so I just didn't get to know Tsokolo as well as I got to know Fusi.
Why did he not want to work with you?
I think that's when you invite a writer to come into your life and to work as intensely as I want to work, it means being prepared to withstand a huge amount of scrutiny, a huge amount of time. I mean, I took masses of Fusi's time. It has to be something you really, really want to do and need to do. And if you don't, it's just not going to work for either of us.
You, in the book, call Fusi a most unreliable guide. As you wrote the story, you found that memory and truth are often divergent. So how do you reconcile the different versions of the story that you got?
So, I think that all of us are unreliable guides to what happened in the past. Everybody. The moment you remember something, the moment you make a story out of something, you are changing it. And that is just inevitable. That's the nature of memory. But it hit me so forcefully in writing this book because for the first 3 years of working on this project, the transcript of the trial was lost. And all I had were people's memories. And everybody's memory was different. The prosecutor, the lawyers, Fusi, his co-accused. And finally, after 3 years, the audio tapes of the trial were found, and I had them transcribed and read them, and found that it was a very, very imperfect apartheid trial. But some things all the parties agreed were true. And everybody, all these years later, had forgotten what they knew to be true back in 1992. And so having this contemporaneous written record and comparing it to everybody's memories was really very, very interesting. I really got a close-up sense of how fallible and unreliable everybody's memories are.